disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
Where, what, when? AI knows the answer. Big Brother is real, with all the opportunities and risks it brings. Beyond fingerprints.
Beyond fingerprints, the global expansion of AI surveillance technologies. We're talking about the risks. What are the risks to privacy rights, freedom of expression, and democracy? And I have the great pleasure now of introducing our panelist. Hoan Ton-That joins us. He is the CEO and the founder of Clearview AI. And Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler is Senior Director of the Counter Extremism Project. Welcome to both of you. And Hoan, I'd like to begin with you because your company, Clearview AI, you have been getting a lot of headlines. So let's break down and talk about a little bit what it is that you guys are doing. You have this facial recognition technology, which is using AI. It's being used by law enforcement in some cases, for example, in the US, as a tool to help identify people. What is the difference between that and mass surveillance? And can it be used in mass surveillance?
Hey, Sarah, thanks so much for having me on. And Clearview AI is basically a search engine for faces. It works like a Google for faces. You put in an image and it returns photos that are publicly available from around the internet that may match that person. So one thing about it that is a common misconception that it is mass surveillance. It's facial recognition, but it's not running 24/7 inside a surveillance camera. It's used for after-the-fact investigations. So that's basically what Clearview AI does, and it's quite a lot different from other facial recognition technologies as it's not deployed in real time. And when we've looked to deploy the technology here in the United States, we've added certain controls where people can only do a search if there is a case number and a crime type. So it's not quite like the movies where you get picked up on a camera just because of a facial match. We have investigators, we train them to make sure they only use it in an investigative kind of manner.
That's a really important distinction, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about those distinctions as we move forward in the conversation, so thank you for sharing. Hans-Jakob, I'd like to turn with you because you focus on counterterrorism. You previously worked in the capacity, in fact, of advising the Security Council at the UN on what monitoring needs to be in place, how it can be effective in counterterrorism, in combating groups like ISIS, for example. When you hear about the technology that Hoan is developing, AI, facial recognition. Do you think more about the potential for law enforcement to tap into that, or do you think about issues, for example, like privacy rights?
Both issues are important. Of course, biometric facial recognition is indispensable in law enforcement. It's been a tool that's been used for quite a long time if you think about biometric passports for border control. And that's why the Security Council in 2014 and then again in 2017 mandated the use of biometric data and facial recognition to control the travel, return, and relocation of foreign terrorist fighters from ISIL. But AI and facial recognition technology is by no means restricted just to law enforcement. What is really a big concern and really necessitates that this technology is regulated in general is the use by private companies. For example, you may have heard last year, Facebook settled a massive lawsuit because it used facial recognition without telling its customers. While law enforcement may infringe on the rights of people in one country, Facebook infringes the rights of people globally. So, even more for the private sector, we need a clear regulation of this technology.
A clear regulation. But, in the meantime, when we're waiting for that clear regulation, and I just want to be very transparent with our viewers here, we're also supposed to have a representative from Human Rights Watch on our panel. He's having some problems connecting to the panel. But one of the perspectives that he wanted to bring in for us was basically the fact that we are seeing governments around the world using this technology to a certain extent. In surveillance, and I'd like to ask you, Hoan, then in that context, What do you think about the potential for authoritarian governments to potentially tap into what it is that you are developing, which it seems like you have, very good intentions for its use, and you have a certain process in place when it comes to privacy. Does it give you a little bit of pause when you think about, maybe the negative aspects of it?
Yeah, absolutely. We're always worried about how this could be misused. We're the largest facial recognition company in the United States. We've been used to great effect to help solve crime, especially crimes against children, human trafficking and drug trafficking, all which cross borders. But we haven't expanded outside of the US because we want to make sure we get everything correct in terms of who we sell to and what purposes it's for. So yeah, there are purposes that it could be used for or misused for, and we just want to make sure we get it right. So, I think that regulation is needed in this space. There's a whole patchwork, at least in the United States, of different state and local laws. And in the EU, there's different regulations, and in other parts of the world, there's none at all. So I think what we want to do is kind of take a step by self-regulating in a lot of ways, by limiting the scope of facial recognition and really learning and studying what's a really good use case.
Let's talk.
So, for example, when people talk about, I'm just going to give an example, we don't do real-time facial recognition, but it's been done before in the UK. And I think some of those use cases are for something that's very extreme, people with outstanding warrants, really bad known terrorists and things like that.
Yeah, I think one of the differences and the things that's maybe so concerning to people, is when this becomes aimed at people who might not be suspects, who might not be in the realm of being inquired about by law enforcement. And I'd like to bring in Amos Toh now, who's joining us from Human Rights Watch. I think he's been able to connect. So Amos is going to give us his perspective on this conversation. Amos, we've been hearing a little bit about the use of AI technology, about facial recognition, for example. And I wanted to ask you if you could maybe put it into the context of our basic rights, our privacy, our human rights. How are you seeing this technology being used around the world in places, for example, like China, which is quite well known for the potential of its surveillance in that particular country? Tell us a little bit more about what you've been seeing at Human Rights Watch.
Well, I think the record of facial recognition is one that is incredibly abusive and, not necessarily even that accurate, right? We saw that the National Institute of Science and Technology in the United States in 2019 actually put out a study saying that facial recognition algorithms that are commercially available are more likely to falsely identify people of color and women and older people rather than middle-aged white men, which confirmed a 2018 NIST study, MIT study that found similar things. I think, even if it is accurate, there is also immense potential for discrimination and human rights abuses. We have seen facial recognition being used in Russia to detain peaceful protesters. We have seen facial recognition being used on children in Argentina. We have also documented the use of a public camera system with equipped facial recognition software in Myanmar, which could possibly be used to escalate repression. And in the United States itself, we have seen multiple cases of abusive behavior by law enforcement when they engage not just in facial recognition, but many other forms of surveillance. And we see facial recognition being expanded to not just deprive us of our privacy and civil liberties, but also to cut off access to essential public goods. I was just recently in Texas, where the unemployment agency uses facial recognition to screen unemployment claimants. And I just spoke with a worker who ultimately told me that she was qualified for unemployment insurance, but could not receive it because facial recognition software used by the agency had erroneously denied her. that benefit.
So Hoan, then I'd like to get your response to that, because this is really something you probably hear a lot about, not only from rights groups, but you've had lawsuits, for example, complaints that have been brought up against your technology. One was recently filed, for example, here in Europe by a number of civil society organizations. How do you respond to citizens who say, I don't want to be part of your database. I feel like that's an infringement of my privacy, of my fundamental rights. What do you say to them?
So first of all the information we collect is collected legally, and it's all publicly available information. Anything you could find with a web browser on the internet. And we totally understand the concerns about racial bias and accuracy. So when we've trained our algorithm, we've made sure that it has data from all different types of ethnicities. The last thing we want is for anyone to be misidentified. And on top of that, we don't let our investigators use a facial recognition match as the sole source of arrest. We make sure they do follow-up verification, and any bad use of facial recognition has always come down to improper training of law enforcement. So just like any other tool that they use, it needs to be trained, and they need to have the training to understand that these are just keys, not an evidence to go arrest someone based solely on a match. And secondly, I do think that, I'm a person of mixed race. It's very important for me that facial recognition is accurate across all demographics. And when you look at some of these studies, yeah, there are still differences between certain demographics, maybe for other algorithms and older ones. But today, I would say that the top algorithms on the NIST ranking and many others have way better accuracy than the human eye. What's very interesting is when I heard about the Innocence Project, they're saying that 70% of wrongful convictions are coming from eyewitness testimony. And that's evidence in court. Facial recognition today is not evidence in court. You can't say these two faces are the same by an algorithm. You have to bring other evidence. So I think that there's a lot of controls in place in terms of the human review of these things. And when it comes to automated decision-making, that's something that we don't do. However, I would say when it comes to unemployment fraud and things like that, those have boomed so much during COVID, and that, these algorithms are always improving and getting better. So I can't speak to the other case over there, but it's an important issue to us. And we really believe that we want to get the best out of technology while minimizing as much downside as possible.
Thank you so much for clarifying that for us. Hans-Jakob Schindler, I'd like to ask you to weigh in now on everything that you've been hearing. And, perhaps you can also give us a sense of, from the work that you're doing, what do we need to be aware of as citizens, do you think? Who is watching us? Where is our data being used? What should we be aware of?
Well, there are a couple of points here. I think a real problem is that we don't have enough internet literacy here, right? Because where you post your piece on this or that social media platform is called an account, creates the illusion that it's somewhat private. Well, you're actually broadcasting to the globe here. And that's why there are so many pictures on the internet these days. So it's really the understanding is missing that you are giving away a lot of your data to companies who primarily are set up to collect as many data of you as possible. In law enforcement, there is a problem here. Obviously, the technology is out now. You can get it anywhere in the world. So preventing abuse in China, from Germany, or from the US is going to be a tough order. So as a first step, I would say, we need to make sure that it's not misused in our countries before we're trying to address stuff in China. I highly doubt that the Chinese government at this point would be in any way willing to talk about restrictive use of AI or biometric facial recognition.
Yeah, fair point. So then, Hoan, I'd like to ask you, in the context of what you're doing, what do you think is the best approach in terms of making sure that privacy concerns are addressed? Because you have a process, for example, at your company, in terms of how the technology, how you are allowing it to be used. So maybe you can walk us through that process that you have, how you came to arrive at that process and why, and also whether you think that it's fair, for example, that you have been the ones who have been trusted to come up with that process. Should we feel comfortable with that, you think?
Sure, I'll take a walkthrough of how our process works. It's quite simple. Someone in law enforcement, we only sell to law enforcement at this time, requests access to the use of facial recognition, Clearview AI. So they've typically heard about it through success from other law enforcement agencies. We then call them, we vet them, we make sure that their command staff and everyone in the agency is aware they're doing a trial. And we then give them out a trial for a limited number of days. And at the end of it, they should have at least 10, 20 successes where they've been able to solve a crime that they haven't been able to solve before. We also really encourage them to have a facial recognition policy. What types of crimes do they use it for? What types of crimes don't they use it for? And a lot of agencies have done that. And then after going through training on how to use the tool responsibly, knowing that these results aren't evidence in court, one thing we do that other facial recognition companies don't do is we remove the percentage match on the results. So it's really up to them to find and identify the people. And after that, then with those successes, most of the time they end up procuring the technology. So that's the whole onboarding process. There's always an administrator designated at that agency to overview every search that's been done. So they can look at the case number and the crime type of each search. They can generate a report quite easily. And so if anyone asks questions, what has it been used for? How has it been used? They can answer those, and they can turn off any accounts at any time. So that's the process. It's quite controlled. It's not in a camera in real time or anything like that. And what we've seen so far is thousands and thousands of crimes that have been solved that otherwise wouldn't have been. So, when it comes to children, for example, a lot of children now are the victim of sexploitation. This is abuse online, where someone will groom them purely through the internet. You might be in the safest neighborhood. You might have your kids and in a safe neighborhood, but they can be abused over the period of 2 or 3 years. And we heard from the FBI, they tripled their rate of IDing the victims of child abuse. So when they arrest a pedophile, they have all these photos there. And for the first time ever, they might find them in a public photo on Instagram. They might find them in a school photo, like music, in a band or something. And identifying them allows them to contact the parents and then help them get help.
That's really interesting. And Amos, I'd like to get your reaction to that, because I mean, one of the conversations, of course, always in human rights is that, some rights are not absolute. And so I'd like to ask you, when you hear about, potentially some of the positive security benefits that Hoan has mentioned, what do you think about that? And what is the conversation that you're having within human rights? Do you have a position, for example, right now on facial recognition technology?
Well, I mean, I think that, the potential for abuse of facial recognition is really great and has actually been fairly well documented, but I'm not sure that the benefits have. Right. I think the potential for abuse in many cases actually outweighs any purported benefits. I personally haven't seen the statistics that the FBI has put out on the effectiveness of facial recognition, but we know that facial recognition certainly has been very effective in facilitating human rights abuses here and abroad, right? And we don't think that regulation can actually meaningfully curb the abuses of facial recognition. There is a reason why companies like Amazon and Microsoft have imposed their moratorium on their own sales of facial recognition to US law enforcement agencies. And that's because of the sheer potential of abuse that they themselves are seeing and that we have documented very well across the world.
Hans-Jakob, I'd like to ask you, you can react to what Amos just said there, and then also perhaps tell us about other threats that you potentially see that AI might pose to our societies. I know you've done a lot of work, for example, on deep fakes, so perhaps you can also broaden our conversation a little bit more and tell us what you have your eye on right now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to make clear that we don't conflate on one and one on many here as far as facial recognition is concerned. So I respect the position of Human Rights Watch, but The benefits of one-on-one recognition, i.e. is the person in the passport picture the same person that is in front of a border control agent, is absolutely beneficial to let the people that are supposed to be in the country into the country. There's been an ICAO, this is the Civil Aviation Organization, study of border control agents, and a human recognition of border control agents, trained border control agents, for a passport picture to the person in front of them had a failure rate of 30%. That is, and it didn't depend on age or gender or training or experience. It was consistently 30% misidentification of the person from the passport photo. That number is significantly reduced since many countries are starting to use biometric passports. So in a way, that is actually a great benefit. The problems that Human Rights Watch, I think, is referring to is the one on many, i.e. I have a picture and I want to, or I a person and I want to see that person in a massive amount of data. There are still obviously some technical problems that need to be worked out, but then again, the technology is out there. Of course, we can stop the technology being used in Germany or being used in the US. I doubt that Russia or China are going to follow the lead here. So the only way to reduce the problem systematically is through regulation in our countries and then political pressure, because we have recognition in regulation in other countries.
Oh, Hoan, just very briefly, because we're actually running out of time, I have to get you to respond to that, because you were highlighting some of your process, for example, that you're going through. It seems as if you've given it quite a lot of thought, and I'm wondering if you might want to see something from regulators, for example, to sort of level the line, or what you might want to see.
Sure, yeah, we definitely want to see regulation in the space and a lot of guidelines. Again, there's a patchwork in different states around biometric regulation and also around the whole entire world. So I think guidelines would be a really good thing, and we're always in dialogue with potential regulators about what we do, just to educate them and show them what we've done so far to help control the technology. And secondly, I would say that a ban would be irresponsible. This thing has solved so many crimes. You're talking about thousands and thousands of cases just that we know of alone at Clearview AI. And they're very, very compelling. That's what keeps us very motivated with our mission to help law enforcement catch criminals and also identify victims of crime. So in practice, I think it's something that what we've seen is just such a tremendous response with thousands of cases solved. You're talking about hundreds of millions in one case for money laundering. You're talking about saving a 7-year-old girl being abused by a pedophile online. That was written about in the New York Times most recently. And so these things are very, very compelling. And when you weigh the benefits of being able to identify criminals that you would never identify otherwise, and catching them and saving victims against the downside, it's all public data. The information's out there anyway. And then we're always trying to address those downsides with the controls we have. I think a ban would be an irresponsible thing at this time, because it's shown to be quite effective. And I think we can address all the privacy concerns working together with different organizations out there, privacy organizations and the like, and really get people comfortable with what the tool is used for and what it's not used for. And I think once they see that, they'll be a lot more comfortable with,
And I'd like to just give us then an opportunity to talk about how that might be possible and what ideas you might have. If I'm a citizen, for example, and I'm very concerned about my privacy, how is it that, what might I do, for example, right now to help address some of my concerns? And I'd like to ask in 3 sentences or less, if you can all just give us a very quick idea, some action-oriented approaches for our viewers before we go. And I'll begin with Hans-Jakob.
My first plea would be, before we have more regulation, don't put data out there for public use. Your social media profile is a global postcard. You can log in, you can set privacy settings. Google or Facebook or Twitter has all your data. So be careful what you post. Not every picture needs to be publicly displayed. This literacy, I think, is the most important. And then we have to have a public discussion on how we're going to use these new technologies, including deepfakes, including cryptocurrencies, including facial recognition, as a society. What is acceptable to us, what is not acceptable to us. Stopping any of this is going to be impossible. If you ban it completely, all you're going to have is criminal organizations figuring out a use on how they can deploy that technology. You just basically push it underground.
Amos, your quick thoughts.
Well, I think that we shouldn't expect the individual to go up against powerful companies and powerful governments in the use of what is a potentially very abusive technology. This is a social problem. It's a social issue, right? And we have seen, for example, the proposal of the European Commission to regulate AI, which, to its credit, does contain general prohibition of law enforcement uses of biometric identification in public spaces. But it gives law enforcement broad carve-outs in certain criminal investigations and counterterrorism efforts, loopholes that really ought to be closed in the protection to protect fundamental rights.
Thank you so much. Hoan, your thoughts?
I would want to echo what Hans-Jakob was saying about just being aware of information and it being out there and how easy it is for people to post, and how I think we're learning as a society that a lot of things in social media are on the record, and I think that we're also adapting. A lot of people have a good idea if something's public, private, or just for friends. And again, I think that just for people to understand in a certain context, where you're trying to identify a criminal or identify a victim of a crime, I think having access to as much data as possible, carving out all the really private data that people have. So again, Clearview AI only searches public information. I think that's an acceptable use case. Now, if you gave this to the hands of everybody, if it was a consumer application, which we've decided not to do, that would be a different story. So I think when it comes to context, maybe banking is something where, it's consent-based. I'm opting in to give my face. We unlock our phones with our faces every day. So I think context is key when it comes to what data is used from where.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your honest opinions on this very, you have to say, controversial and hot issue. So we really appreciate that. That concludes our panel, Beyond Fingerprints, the global expansion of AI technologies potentially being used for surveillance.